In this particular topic, we are going to look at economic anthropology, its meaning, scope, and relevance. This chapter is essentially important from two perspectives. One, of course, it enormously helps in anthropology as an optional, but it also gives you an overall understanding of how economic systems operate and what kind of ideologies and customary traditions influence the production, distribution, and consumption patterns, especially in traditional and indigenous communities. Now, knowledge of this is extremely critical for you to understand the impact of globalization on indigenous communities and also, and more importantly, the tribal societies. Now, globalization and its impact is a topic that you have in general studies. It's also a topic you have obviously in anthropology in both paper 1 and paper 2. And this particular chapter is going to lay the theoretical foundations for us to understand the larger impact of what is going on in the name of economic development or economic growth, the models of development that are being followed across the world, and the growing trend of transnational capitalism, the emphasis on surplus, market economy, and everything else. So, this particular chapter is extremely relevant for both your general studies and also anthropology. So, that makes it a very significant chapter. The first topic in this particular chapter is meaning, scope, and relevance of economic anthropology, and we shall see what economic anthropology is. Now, one of the questions that people always ask is, why should we have a separate discipline called anthropology when there are so many other social sciences which are already dealing with man? This was a question that we raised in the chapter 1, and there we emphasized on the three unique methods that anthropologists adopt: historical, holistic, and comparative methods. And more importantly, in the context of social and cultural anthropology, we use ethnographic method, which involves a longitudinal study, a long field work, staying with the indigenous communities and the tribal societies, learning the language, and adopting methods like participant observation, interviews, etc. to gather data. Now, there are many parallels in anthropology for most of the subjects that are there in social sciences too. Today, we are going to draw an analogy between economics and economic anthropology. Economics is much older to anthropology. In fact, it is a well-developed science having its own methods, tools, and theories and models through which it tries to explain the various modes of production, distribution, and consumption. Economics is a science that's not only helping the academia across the world, but most of the countries of the world are actually dependent on the economists and their theories and models for the development of their respective nations. Every state has an economic advisory panel, including India. And it is these economic models that we put to test, and it is based on the advice, policy, and the methods suggested by the economists that the state and the cabinet will start implementing the policies and designing the policies. Now, why should we have a separate discipline when economics is already a well-established one? What is the need for economic anthropology when you already have economics? And what is the relationship between economics and anthropology is something that we will be exploring in this particular topic. Let us first look at what economic anthropology is. We can very simply define economic anthropology as a cross-cultural study of production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. You know that every society in this world is made up of 5 primary social institutions. Economy constitutes one of the 5 primary social institutions. And why did this institution come into existence? It came into existence in order to take care of our needs, especially the material wants in life, and also to provision for food and nutrition. The very first human societies in the world were hunters and gatherers. They did not have access to any kind of a technology. Man was living in a savage state of life, foraging for food, and he used to consume whatever was available or made available by the nature. And subsequently, horticulture, pastoralism, agriculture, finally culminating in industrial revolution, has happened. But throughout the evolution of the economic institutions, certain things remain constant, and that is, this particular institution is primarily responsible for 3 things: production of goods and services that we require, and then once the goods and services are produced, they have to be distributed across the people in the society, so that the third thing happens, which is consumption. Ultimately, we are producing everything for consumption, whether it is a good like the food that is grown by the farmers, or the various FMCG goods and commodities produced by the industry, or we are also producing services, like I am right now producing a service, teaching anthropology, and you're consuming that service. So whether it is good or a service, economic organizations are primarily responsible for taking care of production, distribution, and consumption. Economic anthropology can be defined as a cross-cultural study of production, distribution, and consumption. Why are we emphasizing on the word cross-cultural? There is a very big story behind it. When economics as a science came to establish itself, unfortunately, most of its theory was built on the study of Western, industrialized, and capitalist nations. The whole of economic theory is based on the study of capitalist models of production, distribution, and consumption. But capitalism, where everything is manufactured for profit, and westernization and modernization, where technology, advancements in science, and access to resources is very sophisticated, is not a model that is followed everywhere in the world. There are many indigenous communities and traditional economies which do not have access to technology the way the modern capitalist nations have. Even after the Second World War, many of the third world, the so-called third world countries like India, have struggled to gain access to technologies, and we started experimenting with the various modes of production and distribution to ensure that there is an equitable distribution of everything we produce, and also at the same time taking care of the poor people who cannot afford or who do not have access to the various goods and services. So nations across the world started experimenting with various models of production and various models of distribution and consumption. And most importantly, a majority of indigenous cultures, like for example our own farmers in India, especially those who are toiling day in and day out in backward areas of the country, and the majority of the tribal societies who are still isolated geographically or at least socially and politically, are using primitive technologies and pre-industrial and some of them pre-agricultural levels of technologies to take care of their basic needs. Now, anthropology's primary emphasis is on the comparative method, isn't it? So, we would like to know how the various societies across the world have made different arrangements in order to meet their needs of goods and services. How do people across the world are provisioning for goods and services within the levels of their own technology, levels of their own culture, and most importantly, the environment, because not all of us on earth live in the same kind of an environmental condition, and the primary resources are the ones that are provisioned by nature. We don't manufacture them. So we require a cross-cultural study. We require a study that will be able to put all of them in some sort of a periodic table. And then we can compare them, and in the process we will understand and appreciate how the human cultures have started evolving. How did they start improvising themselves? And how they have improved their access to the natural resources, the human resources, and how they started exploiting even their financial resources. So that is the reason why we do not confine economic study only to modern societies, but we also study all the primitive, indigenous, traditional, pre-industrial and pre-agricultural societies also, something that economists seldom do. So economic anthropology hence can be very easily and simply defined as a cross-cultural study of production, distribution and consumption of goods and services. And then in 1989, Platner defined economic anthropology as the study of economic institutions using ethnographic methods. Now, I don't have to tell you about ethnographic approach. Ethnographic approach, as I was just telling you, entails an in-depth, holistic, historical, comparative study of a single society, using multiple methods of anthropology, including participant observation. And Platner defines economic anthropology as the study of economic institutions, just like the way we study every other social institution in the culture of any society. It is a part and parcel of an anthropologist's everyday job to study even the economic institutions, just like the way we studied family, marriage and kinship, the way we are going to study the political institutions later on, or religion and customs and belief systems. The same methods, the same techniques that we have developed, called ethnographic techniques, are deployed to understand the economic institutions. It is this empirical approach to the study of economic institutions that sets economic anthropology apart from economics. Now, from the chapter 1, if you get a question on what is the difference between economics and economic anthropology, or what is the relationship between economics and anthropology, this is the one that you are expected to understand. So that is the most important point. What makes us very different from economics is the fact that we are using anthropological method to understand the economic institutions. As I was telling you, the modern science of economics is based on the study of developed capitalist economies and industrial societies. And how can we explain the nature of traditional economies based on the concepts which are developed on the basis of studying a modern capitalist economy? Tell me. The models of economics are developed within the capitalist context, market economy context, a westernized and probably industrialized society. And anthropologists felt right from the beginning that the models of the science of economics maybe are inadequate to understand the nature of traditional economies. And that is the reason why anthropologists thought that they should develop their own way of understanding the so-called primitive economies. And let me remind you once again, the word primitive is an unfortunate choice in anthropology, which originally was born in the Western ethnocentric thought process. The original band of scholars, travelers, missionaries, historians, and the colonial administrators, when they encountered the non-industrialized and non-Western cultures, they slapped the nomenclature of the word primitive to denote us. We are not primitive in our culture in any way, and we are not primitive in our belief systems. In fact, the Eastern and the so-called non-Western cultures are much more sophisticated in their religious ideologies and in their complex belief systems. The word primitive here only denotes the levels of technology that the indigenous communities have access to. They are primitive compared to the modern industrialized technologies. Otherwise, they are not primitive in their non-material culture. The word primitive here denotes only the material culture and especially technology, which is used to access and also to manipulate the resources so that our needs can be met. So, having said that, anthropologists argue that economics as a science is probably inadequate to understand the economic behavior of traditional economies, and hence the need for economic anthropology. Let's look at the history of economic anthropology. You may not find it directly relevant for the exam, but it's important for us to appreciate the history, is because that's only when we will know how economic anthropology came into existence and what kind of academic dimensions and paradigms it was embracing while it was evolving from one time to the other. Economic anthropology probably began without anthropology's knowledge during the time of Bronislaw Malinowski. Bronislaw Kasper Malinowski is one of the pioneering anthropologists. We did look at him a couple of times whenever I talk about functionalism, a theory we are going to see later. Malinowski was the first anthropologist to engage with economics in his ethnographic research that he conducted and published one of the most important monographs in anthropology called The Argonauts of Western Pacific. This was way back in 1922. And while studying this particular community, which we call as the Trobriand Islands, in the modern day geography they are called the Kirivina Islands off the coast of New Guinea, Malinowski argued that the economic behavior of the traditional people like the Trobriand Islanders do not or does not fit the models of modern science of economics. The reason is because he described how these people in these communities involve in activities called the Kula exchange or the Kula ring, something we are going to see shortly, which is a ceremonial gift exchange, where people are trading shell valuables like armbands and necklaces to achieve social distinction and not material satisfaction. Normally, you and I procure a commodity, a good or a service because it gives us some kind of a satisfaction in terms of consumption. That is integral to the consumer behavior. The reason we go and buy or bargain and procure, whether it is within our means or not, is immaterial. We still go and get it by hook or crook because it gives us that satisfaction when we consume it. But when it comes to so-called economic arrangements like the Kula exchange, it is not the material satisfaction that the people are getting by exchanging the valuables, the so-called valuables vis-a-vis their culture, but they are doing it for social distinction. And this is when Malinowski questions how relevant and how appropriate is the modern economic model to explain arrangements which are so customary and traditional as we find in the likes of Trobriand Islands everywhere else in the world. And Malinowski also stressed the role that is played by magical and religious practices. Together we call them the magico-religious practices that these islanders have in order to ensure success of production and also trading. Who is an Argonaut? An Argonaut is a seafarer. An astronaut is the one who travels to the space, whereas an Argonaut is a person who is traveling on the seas. And that is why the name of the book, Argonauts of Western Pacific. And these are the people, the Trobriand Islanders. I have given you the map there. It's an archipelago of many islands. And these people keep traveling in their canoes or those traditional boats from one island to the other, traveling on the high seas, going against the forces of nature, against all odds, to ensure that they do their regular economic exchanges and at the same time carry on the ceremonial exchanges like the Kula. And they pray for a little bit of support from the supernatural. And that's why magic and religion are an integral part of their production, distribution and trading practices. This is something that we can see even in our traditional Indian cultures also, right? In fact, most of our festivals, most of our customs are towards appeasing the gods, towards appeasing the spirits. Farmers even today conduct sacrifices to ensure that they will have a good harvest that year. So you see, magic and religion together are actually the part and parcel of the economic institutions also, not only in the Trobriand Islands, but everywhere else in the world. One has to look for it, and definitely you will discover them. So, the boundaries between economics and religion have blurred. If you look at the institutional makeup in the traditional societies, you see that the various social institutions are not clear-cut. They actually overlap with each other and there are no clear-cut distinctions. So, the boundaries between one institution and the other are so blurred that one institution seamlessly flows into the other, like the rainbow, like the spectrum. It's like a continuum. So, when the institutions are not distinct, and institutions like religion have made inroads into the economic institutions and vice versa, this raises the question of what constitutes economy in primitive societies. Unfortunately, economics as a science will not be able to explain to us what's going on there, because economics is more about models, more about GDP, GNP, per capita income, employment rates and trade and fiscal deficits and modern budgets, allocations, sustainable use of resources, efficient exploitation of all the resources like financial, human and natural. And profit is the single most important motive in most of these market exchanges or modern capitalist economies. So we require a different approach, a specialized approach to understand this institutional overlap and this kind of an institutional interaction that is taking place between economy, religion, maybe politics, and everything else. And that is how economic anthropology came into existence to provide an answer to this enigma of how or what constitutes economy in a traditional society. The emergence of economic anthropology as a formal science happened when Herskovits, Melville Herskovits, has published the book Economic Anthropology in 1952. So it began with Malinowski, who started the discourse on what constitutes economy in 1920s. But a formal thrust, an academic thrust, was provided when Herskovits published this book called Economic Anthropology in 1952. And then later on in 1957, one of the greatest milestones and the most important publication is by this economic historian Karl Polanyi happened when the book called The Great Transformations was penned by him. And in that particular book, he introduces three types of exchange systems to us, which we are going to see in a great detail later, called reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. The modern science of economics is based on only the market exchange. But there are also, according to Polanyi, reciprocity and redistributive models of exchange that will happen. These are the distribution models. Once the goods are produced, they have to reach the end consumer. And reciprocity, redistribution, and market are the three ways in which it can reach a consumer. And then Marshall Sahlins in 1972, he further divided reciprocity into generalized reciprocity, balanced and negative reciprocities, and arranged them in a continuum to further clarify what and how the exchanges can happen in societies across the world, and not necessarily only through market systems where profit is a motive. So we are going to look at that as a separate topic. It's a very important aspect of our discussion as a part of your syllabus. And there has been a very big debate that has gone on in anthropology, economic anthropology, between 1950s and 1970s, and a little later after that also. It's a polemic debate, a debate that did not have any fruitful outcome. But the debate is all about answering a single question: can we use modern economic theory to understand the nature of traditional economies? Academia involved in anthropology divided themselves into two schools of thought. One school of thought, called the substantivists, say, no, you cannot use the modern economics to understand traditional economies because culture, religion, and everything else influences economic behavior, whereas formalists like Leclerc and Schneider, they say that modern economic theory is as relevant to understanding a traditional economy as much as it is relevant to understanding a market economy. And we are going to see that debate in a great detail. But substantivists were led by people like Polanyi, and on the other side we have people like Herskovits, who say that economy is all about rational choices people make in the light of scarcity, and scarcity being universal, man everywhere, whether he is in the tribal society of Africa or somebody who is actually trading stocks on the Wall Street, it doesn't matter, man everywhere is making a rational choice. So according to the formalists, the concept of economy is universal, rationality is universal, whereas substantivists say no, economy is an instituted process and culture, customs, and a larger social design decides how those decisions are made. So, modern economic theory is inadequate to understand traditional economies. But that particular time, during those 3 or 4 decades, the emphasis on economic anthropology was on distribution and exchange systems. And nothing much happened because of this debate that was going on, and whatever little study economic anthropologists did was emphasizing on the nature of exchange systems, reciprocity, redistribution, and market. And then in 1970s, Marxism started having its influence on anthropology. Marxist anthropology as a philosophy, as a school of academic thought, started having its influence on the research in anthropology. And Marxism is all about the systems of production, capitalism, socialism, communism. So 1970s is the time when Marxist anthropologists started shifting their focus to production from exchange. People like Eric Wolf, they argued that the European capitalist expansion has transformed the societies throughout the world. Colonialism is a form of capitalist expansion, isn't it? The colonialists' ultimate motive was to plunder the various colonies that they have, captured. That's what has happened to a country like India also. Billions of dollars, in those days dollar rates, have been plundered from the country. And that capital expansion of the Europeans, the colonial expansion of the Europeans, has had a massive impact and transformed the societies in the world, especially the third world. So anthropologists no longer can afford to study the traditional economies in isolation, because the traditional economies across the world were suddenly juxtaposed with the modern capitalist societies. Claude Miasson in 1981, he conducted a detailed ethnographic study of the African tribes and articulated the modes of production in those tribes. And he focused on production systems rather than on the distribution systems, and he showcased in his works how the dominant capitalist mode of production, which extracts surplus resources and which extracts surplus labor, has impacted the tribal communities and their societies. Claude Miasson. And then Marxist anthropologists like Donham, they went on to focus on how inequalities are perpetuated in the societies by using the strength of power and ideology, and how the capitalist mode of production is responsible for bringing that gulf, that divide between the people into haves and have-nots. And the absence of equity, social justice, is something that these Marxist anthropologists started focusing on. That happened mostly in US, but that was an integral part of economic anthropology's research during the 1980s. In the last 3 decades, the boundaries between economics and economic anthropology have become more fuzzier. The reason? Anthropologists started making inroads into the domains which were hitherto, dominated by economists. The reason why anthropologists started focusing on what economists have been focusing on or are focusing on is because of the emergence of unorthodox or heterodox economics everywhere. Today you see across the world, Western societies are having an impact on the East. A traditional farmer in India is as much impacted by what's happening on the Capitol Hill or the Wall Street as much as a multinational giant. And today we are experimenting with different models of economic arrangements everywhere. And this is the time when you see that anthropologists started publishing enormously on the domains of globalization, in the domain of globalization. The monographs that anthropologists started publishing have been emphasizing on the cultural, social, institutional, economic analysis of how the local is interacting with the global, which you and I call as globalization. And we are going to look at globalization, its various socio-cultural dimensions and psychological dimensions when I come to that topic. And we will be looking at it very elaborately. So, anthropologists started getting into the domains which were hitherto monopolized by economists. So, ultimately, you can conclude this topic on what is economic anthropology by quoting this very important man, General George C. Marshall. He said, economics, after all, at the end of the day, is the study of man in ordinary business of life. I don't know how many of you have heard about General George C. Marshall. He was an American military general. He is a World War hero. And post Second World War, America wanted to develop the Spanish colonies, and they have actually implemented one of the world's largest government-driven development program, which is called the Marshall Plan, named after this general, because he was given the charge of ensuring the success of that program. The Spanish colonies, which were liberated from the European colonial rulers, were suddenly and embarrassingly were in the control of United States. And United States wanted to modernize them, modernize in quotes, and develop them, again within quotes, according to the standards which United States thought is best for them, best for those colonies, and spent millions of dollars in the development program, that socio-economic reconstruction program. But most of that program failed is because the culture and the various traditional institutions of the people in these societies did not permit embracing the models of development that were developed elsewhere in a different social and cultural context, in this case the United States. And he said in one of his discourses that economics is the study of man in ordinary business of life. What is our ordinary business of life? Life itself. Our behavior is governed by multiple stimuli, and those stimuli emanate from all the social institutions, religion, our customs and traditions, institutions like family, marriage and kinship, our own history, our own demography, our own heritage, political systems, our environment, the physical environment, the availability of natural resources, and then of course our needs and how we define them and how important they are in the hierarchy that we have created for ourselves. So economy is not an autonomous, independent superstructure in a society that will react and respond to any tinkering that you may want to do independently. Economy and man in the economics has to be put back in the larger socio-cultural context to understand why is he behaving the way he does. That means you require a holistic, historical and a comparative approach. You require an ethnographic approach to understand economics. And this statement of General Marshall that economics is the study of man in ordinary business of life is the case for economic anthropology. This is the one that captures in its essence the need for a multidisciplinary approach, a need to understand economics as a holistic phenomenon having its own complex connections to the various institutions in the society. So that is the brief history of economic anthropology. So let us summarize the relevance of economic anthropology. We looked at most of these points already, but let's put them in one place so that we can write an answer. Number one, in primitive tribal societies, economies are very closely cognate to their cultures. Economies are very closely linked to their cultures. Now, when culture steps in, obviously the choice will be anthropology, isn't it? There is a need for anthropology to understand the nuances of culture. There is a need for anthropological method to understand the connections and the influences that culture establishes with the economic domain and vice versa. So that is the first point. Number two, to understand the interaction between culture, environment and economics, you require a holistic, historical and a comparative approach. When we look at the theories of culture, we are going to focus on a specific school of thought called neo-evolutionism that has emerged sometime in the 20th century. And most of those thinkers have emphasized on the critical interaction that exists between culture, man and the environment, and the role played by technology and other resources man has access to. There are societies in this world that are blessed with many natural resources, but what they lack is technology. There are societies in this world that have sophisticated technologies, but what they lack are the natural resources. And there are societies who are blessed with both, but what they lack is the human will and the human resource. Culture plays a very important role in striking a balance between culture, economy and environment. And that constitutes a very important component in all our societies, and we are going to see that as a part of our neo-evolutionary school of thought, especially a model of anthropologist Julian Stewart. It's called cultural ecology. There were many other theories like Marvin Harris's cultural materialism and other schools of thought that we are going to explore. But essentially this point is saying that culture, economy and ecology, if you want to really understand the relationship between them, you require an anthropological method, an anthropological approach. In Indian context, Professor L.P. Vidyarthi has introduced a concept called the nature-man-spirit complex, which again talks about the complex interaction going on between nature, which is the physical environment, man, who is the tribal individual, and spirit, which is the religion. So you require the anthropological and ethnographic methodologies in order to explore this relationship. Otherwise, you can't make head or tail of how the traditional economies run and operate. The third reason why we require anthropology to understand economy is because in the tribal societies, kinship, that means the lineage and descent groups like clans, you have politics, religion, everyone playing a role in economic decision making. So economic institutions are not autonomous, economic institutions are not independent. They are always an integral part of the larger society. And the fourth point is what globalization is throwing up now. This so-called transnational capitalism or globalization has enormous cultural significance, and it has an impact on all the people irrespective of whether they are prepared for it or not. Globalization is not just economic, isn't it? It's cultural, psychological, social, and it has multiple dimensions to it. And we'll discuss it when we come to that topic anyway. And then, most importantly, our special interest in the indigenous people, they are being threatened by this transnational capitalists, this multinational corporations, and indigenous people across the world, are being threatened with extinction, extermination, is because they are on the front lines of this globalization process. Why this is happening, we shall see with a nuanced approach when I come to that topic. And national and international economic interests are today dictating national policies. In fact, there is no politics today, everything is economics. India's national policy or any other third world country's national policy is dictated by who? By the economic interests of the superpowers. Multilateral agencies like WTO, IMF, World Bank, they are the ones who are dictating the sovereign policies that countries like ours should have. That's what happened after liberalization. And in our discussion on globalization, we are going to look at it, but national and international policies, political and social policies, ultimately are being dictated by the economic interests of the world today and not any other social interests. Look what has happened because of COVID-19 across the world. When the number of cases were very less, the world was in a lockdown. Well, the lockdown was actually required is because we wanted to spruce up our medical infrastructure and prepare for the worst when the COVID infections reached their peak. But if you look at the unlock policies, unlocking is only happening because it is the economic interests of the nations that are at stake. Factories have come to a grinding halt. Offices stopped working. Employment, started taking a hit. And when the incomes of the people was falling drastically, their consumption patterns also shifted. As a consequence, the demand for goods and the services has come down. So economies went into some kind of a tailspin, and today, in spite of the fact that there is a lurking threat of COVID virus everywhere, we are compelled to open the economies is because, otherwise we would go hungry. We won't have access to the basic resources. So that's how, economic anthropology has found its relevance in even contemporary world than ever before. And then we will move on to quickly summarizing the scope of economic anthropology. Number one, economic anthropology describes the varieties of economic arrangements developed by different cultures in different times and different places. That's what is the comparative approach. The nature of production, distribution, and consumption are different from culture to culture, society to society, and from people to people within the same nation. So, economic anthropology has made it its business to understand the various arrangements and describe them so that we can appreciate how the economic institutions have evolved in different times, in different places, amongst different cultures. Number two, to understand the social and cultural context in which the systems of production, distribution, and consumption and exchange operate. Society, culture, cultural institutions are the ones that determine economic production, distribution, and consumption. And that is the second important point in the scope of study in economic anthropology. Number three, economic anthropology is a holistic study of economics in a society. We are not just confining ourselves only to the study of the primitive economies. Gone were those days where anthropology was interested only in the primitive societies. We are as much interested in the goings on in a modern society as much as we are and we were in the context of the primitive societies. Number 4, it is the study of the economic aspects of social relationships and social aspects of economic relationships. Economics is not something that happens only in the finance ministry. Economics is not something that happens only in the banking, in trade, in commerce. There is economics everywhere. There's economics in religion, there's economics in family, there's economics in marriage, there's economics in kinship. Take the case of dowry, which is an economic dimension of the institution of marriage, or bride price. When we look at the primitive economies, you will understand this point in a greater detail. Take something like gift exchanges. Gift giving and gift taking are obligatory in many societies in the world. There is economy, there is a cost that is involved in gift exchanges. And we don't normally look at gift as an economic transaction, but it is, at the end of the day, it's the brass tacks, isn't it, that matters? But you're using the vehicle of gift in order to further a social relationship or cement a social bond. Friends make gifts and gifts make friends. It looks apparently as a social transaction, but involved in it is an economic dimension. So, we need to look at economics as it exists in every institution. There's economics in education, there's economics in law, there's economics in politics, there's economics in kinship. Economic anthropology is the study of economic aspects of social relationships and social aspects of economic institutions. And then, economic anthropology is an analysis of economic life as a subsystem of the societies. Economics is only one of the subsystems of the society. It coexists with education, religion, politics, kinship, and whatnot, demography. And the outer ring there is the physical environment, which is the one that is giving us the natural resources. Geography also matters a lot. There's a reason why the Eskimos who live in the tundra do not have access to the same resources as someone living in a tropical climate where they have greater access to resources, is because of the physical environment. So you see that economics has to be understood from within the context of the larger society. All those subsystems interact with each other, and you and I looked at this. We call this the systems approach in the first chapter. This is what is holism, where you need to understand the intricate, apparently non-existent connections, and man's behavior, whether it is economic or otherwise, is a response to multiple stimuli emanating from all these institutions and not just a spur of the moment impulse. So these are the points that you can give in the context of the scope of economic anthropology. And these are the various dimensions that we look at, various aspects of human behavior that we look at. Economic anthropology is a specialization that is looking specifically at the institutions of production, exchange, and consumption, and doing so within the larger context of society and culture. And that's what is the primary difference between economics on one hand and economic anthropology on the other.